So be aware that we are now recording. So again, this is the second class of Raised on the Third Day, Exploring the Resurrection. This is the week where we consider the idea of the resurrection in the Old Testament. If you have it, if you have it nearby, please grab a Bible. Please grab a journal or an open Word document or a piece of paper and a pen, and feel free to use the chat box to ask questions and or make comments as I go through this lesson. So here's the overview for the night. I hope I've selected enough material to cover the time, but also not move too quickly through it and leave you in a whirlwind of confusion. So we will be talking about just a brief review of last week's class. And then I want to remind you of this concept of what some biblical scholars call normal wisdom. And this is in many ways sort of the presuppositions that lie behind some of the reflection on the resurrection. And so we'll go to that briefly. And then we'll turn to Isaiah 24 through 27, which is one of the places where we begin to see the idea of the resurrection taking root. And then we will consider the resurrection in Daniel 12 and that passage there, and then open it up for some comments and discussion as well. So just by way of review of last week, remember that last week we spent the majority of the time talking not about the resurrection, but about death, and about how in the Old Testament, death is really the norm. It's really the consistent thing that we see. The resurrection is really the exception. And I said that there were at least 4 things that you could know about death in the Old Testament. The first is that death is natural. It's just something that comes. Some people live to 70, some people live to 80, but generally everybody's going to die, right? That's the rule that the Old Testament presents. That the death is final, and I really sort of paid attention to the ways in which the Old Testament talks about death as breaking off relationship, not only with human beings, but as breaking off relationships with God as well. That when the psalmist says, if I die, I'm not going to be able to praise you anymore. This reflects just the significance and the finality of death. We talked as well about how death can be tragic, particularly an early death or an unfortunate death. And we talked about Hezekiah's prayer in the book of Isaiah as a sort of reflection of that. And then we just talked very briefly about how the Old Testament regards death as dangerous, in the sense that contact with a dead person could render you ritually unclean. Therefore, this idea that maybe this death was contagious, or at least a contagion that would threaten your purity as a Israelite. But it was also dangerous to sort of try to communicate with dead spirits. And so even though there's not a robust understanding of the afterlife in the Old Testament, there are these interesting clues that people in the ancient Near Eastern world at that time were communicating with dead spirits, or at least were claiming to communicate with dead spirits. And that this was a problem in Leviticus and other parts of the Old Testament, to say, we cannot communicate with the dead. The dead are dead and dead. Let's leave them alone. So all of this was leading to this sort of conclusion that there is very little reflection on the afterlife in the Old Testament. And then I briefly pointed out to the 2 exceptions that we'll talk about tonight. So as I mentioned, I want to sort of frame our discussion of Isaiah, and especially Daniel, with what I would refer to as normal wisdom. This is sort of a presupposition to much of the Old Testament writings. It's found, for example, in the book of Deuteronomy and in Proverbs. Lots of the Psalms reflect this sort of presupposition. And there's a few things that we can sort of unpack about this presuppositions. One being that Israel is God's particular people, that Israel and God have a particular relationship. of course, in the ancient Near Eastern world, there were a plurality of gods. And so Israel's God was a particular God, and Israel was a particular nation in relationship to God. And so that particularity is a part of this normal wisdom. And with that, we get these ideas that if Israel is obedient or faithful to the covenant that they have with Israel, with God, that there will be blessings, right? So good things happen to good people, right? Is the sort of basic message there. And that if they're disobedient, if Israel is disobedient to the covenant, what's going to happen? Punishment will happen. Bad things happen, bad consequences happen when you are disobedient or unfaithful to God. And so in this normal sort of wisdom, things like exile or political submission to other regional superpowers are all interpreted as signs of divine punishment, usually for faithlessness, for disobedience, for making religious and political sort of agreements with the neighbors. And so then, therefore, individual and national success are signs of divine favor, right? So in this sort of working of the world, in this working of wisdom, the idea is, it's pretty easy to tell who God has blessed, and it's pretty easy to tell who God has cursed. Because you'll know it by, their bank account, or you'll know it by the car they drive, or you'll know it by the size of their field, or the number of slaves in their household. And so all of this suggests that the world is ordered. It is an ordered world where faithfulness leads to blessing, unfaithfulness leads to curse. And so that's sort of the working presuppositions for most of the Old Testament. We see sort of some reactions to that. The book of Job is a classic reaction to this view of normal wisdom. Some of the lament psalms also sort of challenge this notion of an ordered world. But generally, Proverbs in particular is resting with this view that the world is pretty ordered, and part of that order is shown in how people experience life, the treatment they receive. So again, I want this to be sort of a background, to our conversation about the resurrection in these next two passages. So if you have your Bible, feel free to join me in turning to Isaiah 24 through 27. I'm going to put portions of this text on the slide so that we can all look at the text and see the text. But you're also welcome to use your own Bible and, sort of keep me honest and make sure I'm not lying to you about what's in there. But we will start our study tonight with Isaiah 24 through 27. Sort of a brief orientation to this part of Isaiah. Scholars have named this portion of Isaiah the Apocalypse of Isaiah. And this is because of how Isaiah 24 opens with a mention of the sort of the end, right? The judgment at the end time. At least that's what it has suggested to some scholars. And so there is some debate about whether or not this unit, these 3 or 4 chapters, should be viewed as sort of separate from the material surrounding them, or whether or not it's integrated. And I don't want to get into the sort of the weeds around that question, but there's enough to say that it's a distinct portion of Isaiah that we do well to think of it as a unit, whether or not we think of it as an independent unit to what surrounds it or as a dependent unit to what surrounds it. Because of the question about, sort of it as a unit, it's also difficult for us to date it. Scholars generally think about Isaiah 1 through 39, so the first 39 passages, as originating sometime in the 8th century BCE. So around the time of Isaiah, who's mentioned in other parts of the Old Testament. And then they've begun to say that Isaiah 40 through 55 and 56 through 66 may very well have originated at a time after the lifetime of Isaiah. And this has to do with some clues and some details in these later chapters of Isaiah that suggest it was written at a time after the Babylonian exile, which happened in the late 6th century BCE. So we see that there's some possibility of books being written at different times. And when we think about this portion of Isaiah, it's hard for us to know for certain whether or not it comes from the period of Isaiah in the 8th century, or whether it comes from a later date. And it's been dated as late as the 2nd or 3rd century BCE, and as early as the 7th or 8th century BCE. So there's some debate about that, and why the dating matters. I'm not just dorking out for the sake of dorking out, but it has to do with how we understand the development of the idea of the resurrection and when this began to happen. And the text from Daniel we can date with a good bit of certainty. We're pretty certain we know about when that book was written, and so it allows us to sort of locate, okay, what is Isaiah doing, and then maybe how does Daniel pick it up. Because we know that the Old Testament writings were some of them were reusing material from earlier traditions. So Isaiah 24 through 17 contains a number of different visions of judgment as well as visions of redemption. There's some poetic sort of praise language where the speaker praises God for God's redemption. It's filled with poetic language. It's filled with what I would call symbolic or metaphorical language. It'll talk about Israel as a vineyard, right? You may remember the idea of the people being a vineyard. This is present in this portion of Isaiah. It talks about redemption using the language of elaborate banquets and feasts. So some really powerful language to describe what it looks like when a people are redeemed, when they experience God's salvation. So in addition to that, there are some sort of basic components. Again, you can check me on this after class, but Isaiah 24 through 27 sort of has 4 basic components. The first is it contains several instances where God judges Israel's enemies or Israel's opponents. And there's in chapter 25, I believe, there's a sort of a really short call out of the Moabites. It sort of doesn't fit, but it's there. But in general, it's a judgment, God's judgment on those nations that oppressed Israel, that have maybe taken it under its tutelage, that are sort of dominating it in one way or another. But it also contains some really interesting language about God judging Israel's supernatural enemies. And we see, for example, that the host of heaven are judged by God, and they're actually bound up and put in the pit, which is probably where we get some of our ideas of hell, of a place where typically in Christian circles, right, hell is that place where those angels who were rebellious against God have been confined, and also where humans are tortured for their sins. This might be one of the very early ideas where God's the heavenly host seem to be rivals to the God of Israel, competitor gods or semi-gods or demigods, however you want to talk about them. And at this time in the apocalypse, they've been judged, and they no longer hold sway over the people of Israel. They no longer have the power that they once had over the people of Israel. The second thing that we see happening in Isaiah 24 through 27 is we see the restoration of Israel's fortunes. Part of Israel's experience of redemption, part of Israel's experience of salvation is that they receive their national identity again. They receive their land again. This part of Isaiah sort of has several instances of the people coming from throughout the ancient world and coming back to the holy mountain, to Mount Zion, to the holy place of God. In addition, the third aspect of this portion of Isaiah is the vindication of pious or faithful Israelites. Those who are faithful receive vindication. They receive reward, we might say. And on the other hand, those who oppressed Israel experience punishment. They experience censure, or their resources are deprived of them. The language in Isaiah 24 through 27 often uses spatial language. So those who have been uplifted are brought low, and those who have been trampled underneath the feet of their oppressors are raised up. Now, for those of you that love Advent, that may sound a lot like Mary's Magnificat in Luke's Gospel, and it's very possible that Luke has composed that song in some reference to Isaiah 24 through 27 or other parts of the Hebrew Bible that represent the same sort of those on the lower ranks will be raised up, and those who are on the top will be brought down low. So this is some of what we see in Isaiah 24 through 27. And just to give you a flavor of what judgment looks like in Isaiah 24 through 27, if you were to look at in this passage, the phrase "on that day" occurs 7 times, and most likely that day refers to something like the day of the Lord, the day when God will enact God's judgment, God's just making activity in the world. And so when we look at what will happen on that day, you can see a variety of things that are punished or things that are put right on that day. And I put these all up. I'm not going to cover them all, but I put them up because all of them have a very strong national and this worldly emphasis. So they have that sort of the normal wisdom. They're returning to the normal wisdom that Israel will eventually be blessed again, because Israel is being faithful. And that blessing looks like sort of the securing of their borders. It looks like the restoration of their city. It looks like their holy mountain. They're able to return to their holy mountain. And so it in this apocalypse, right, this apocalypse in Isaiah 24 through 27 takes on a very this worldly emphasis. And before class started, we were talking about Revelation. Very different than what we see in Revelation, where God, the day of the Lord, the day of God's judgment and justice-making action, takes on a very otherworldly emphasis. We see in Isaiah 24 through 27 a very this worldly emphasis. So I want us to look at 3 texts that are within this passage. These are the sort of the texts where people have begun to see the idea of the resurrection in the Old Testament. Although we don't know for certain, it's possible that these are our very earliest reflections on the resurrection, or what we would later think of as the resurrection. And so the first one is from Isaiah 25, 6 through 10. And I'm going to read it out loud. And I want you to just sort of reflect. And the basic question is this resurrection? Is this a text that supports our ideal, our understanding of resurrection? And we'll feel free to sort of type your thoughts in the chat box as I read it. So Isaiah 25, 6 through 10. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food with marrow, of well-aged wines strained clear. And he will destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the sheet that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. Then the Lord God will wipe away the tears from all faces, and the disgrace from his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. It will be said on that day, lo, this is our God. We have waited for him so that he might save us. This is the Lord for whom we have waited. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation, for the hand of the Lord will rest on this mountain. So briefly, feel free to unmute yourself or use the chat box. But anything strike you or surprise you about this, one of the resurrection texts from the book of Isaiah? Yeah. So Chaz has a big question mark next to resurrection. He says, "I see not dying, like the living won't die, but not resurrection of the already dead." Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Chaz. All right. Right. What one of the possibilities is that that actually when the text that I put in red, he will swallow up death forever. There's a possibility that death here is actually a reference to another deity, to another deity that was sort of viewed as Lord over death. Um, Theo, good. Theo says it reminds me of the feast on the return of the prodigal son. If you've ever read Luke's gospel, which is where the prodigal son comes from, Luke's gospel loves banquets. It is a banquet book, and banquets are frequently used as an image for the kingdom of God. And you can begin to see, oh, this is in Isaiah already, that we see this idea that the day of the Lord is accompanied by or demonstrated by a great feast. David Dantzler says it seems to be a promise of restoration after destruction. Does it have to do with forgiveness? Is it salvation? Great. Restoration is a really important word for us to keep in mind as we continue this conversation about Isaiah. Let me just give you a couple of my observations about this text. As I mentioned earlier, the mountain, the word for mountain occurs 4 times in these 4 chapters from Isaiah. And it, I think, signifies Mount Zion or Jerusalem. Jerusalem and the mountain were often sort of conflated, but this is the residence of God in the Old Testament. This is where God takes up shop. This is the place where the temple was. And so when it talks about being restored to the mountain, that has a very this worldly feel to it. It has to do with a very specific geographical location and a very specific set, perhaps, of even buildings or infrastructure that would go around it. We see that this text speaks of a feast, as David Dantzler called our attention to, but it's also the end of grief. It's the end of disgrace, right? No one will cry. The tears will be wiped from their eyes. The book of Revelation in chapter 22 picks up this image from Isaiah as a picture of the new Jerusalem, that the tears of every eye will be wiped clean. And ultimately, this is a period where the people will rejoice in salvation. It's a joyfulness to salvation. And so, as David says, are we to read this text as thinking about sort of the end of days and resurrection to eternal life, like we as Christians tend to think of it, or is it something other than this? Is death literal, or is it symbolic here? Chaz says death as a symbol of Neo-Assyrians or Babylonians. Is death swallowed up? Is it the threat of death that's swallowed up? Is death here a symbol for all of the grief and all of the disgrace that has come with the destruction of Jerusalem, or the threat of the destruction of Jerusalem under foreign powers? Again, it's a symbol that we could take literally, or we could take symbolically. And so that's our first text. And my sense is it's a seed for resurrection thinking, but I'm not sure that we see the already dead being raised up, as Chaz noted earlier. So here's our second text. This is from Isaiah 26, 12 through 15. So just a few verses later. O Lord, you will ordain peace for us, for indeed all that we have done, you have done for us. O Lord, our God, other lords besides you have ruled over us. but we acknowledge your name alone. The dead do not live, shades do not rise, because you have punished and destroyed them and wiped out all memory of them. But you have increased the nation, O Lord. You have increased the nation. You are glorified. You have enlarged all the borders of the land. Now, again, feel free to, I'm calling your attention to some stuff with the red text, but feel free to, in the chat box or use your microphone, just say if anything stands out to you about this verse or these verses, and sort of their feel or their tone. What stands out to you, if anything? Well, I thought David was going to unmute his microphone. He did for a second, but that's fine.
Okay, I did. Can you hear
me?
There
you go. Come on.
Well, in the Old Testament, and these passages remind me, and this is, I don't have a great way to frame this question, but in the context of what we're talking about tonight, the question I have is, does death matter as much to God as it matters to us?
Yeah. Yeah, that's...
You understand what I'm getting at?
Yeah. That's absolutely. That's a great question. That probably pertains to the whole study, right? Whether or not one Norwegian Old Testament scholar wrote that all of human culture is essentially dealing with the reality of death. That all human culture throughout the years is at some level dealing with death. And so religion, as an aspect of culture, obviously is going to deal with death. But you're right. Is God as concerned about death as we are? And probably the answer is no. The dead do not live, etc. Death itself is the punishment. Chad says, yeah, it seems that way, right? The text in gold in red is that those who die are unable. Even their memory is wiped out. Which one of the articles that I read in preparation for tonight says, this is really how some of the Old Testament thinks about the afterlife, is that the way that the Old Testament sort of thinks about the afterlife is that people are remembered. The memory is what is resurrected or kept alive even after someone dies. And that one of the really tragic things would be if a memory is forgotten. And I'm just going to share a quick story with you, and I hope my daughter can't hear me, because this happened literally this week. My daughter, who is 9, almost 10, we were talking one night before bed, I think, and she was saying that she was afraid to die. And so we sort of, okay, right, COVID, we're talking a lot about that, right? It makes sense. But we asked her why, and she said, well, no one will remember me when I'm dead. And we're like, of course, your friends will, and she's like, no, but my friends and my kids, they'll eventually die and people will forget me. And I was like, oh my God, what do I do with this? This is like a extremely deep existential and theological reflection about our memories and about what does it mean for us to hold the memory of another person, and the reality that even our memories will last maybe one generation or two, maybe 3, but oh man, even our memories are futile, it seems. So this text gets, I think, at some of that power of memory. Let me again just share with you a few of my observations. Again, this seems to be dealing with the geopolitical realities that Israel, the speaker says, we have been subjected to other lords besides you. And now we have peace. Now we are, maybe we would say, free, and that freedom is free to be their own nation, free to be their own people. And we see then the sort of the finality of death, right? That says in this text, the dead do not live, shades do not rise, and yet you have increased the nation, O Lord. Which seems to suggest, at least in part, that part of the opposite of death there is not the sort of everlasting life of the individual immortal soul, but it is actually the increase of the nation, that the nation has been, we might say, reborn through God's saving activity. The nation has been rebuilt through God's saving activity, and that therefore the life, the vitality of the nation is its increase. It's getting larger in size. Here's our final text, and this is probably the one text where we get the closest to our understanding of resurrection in the book of Isaiah. So I'll give you a little context. O Lord, in distress they sought you. They poured out a prayer when your chastening was on them. We have won no victories on earth, and no one is born to inhabit the world. Your dead shall live, their corpses shall rise. O dwellers in the dust, awake and sing for joy, for your dew is a radiant dew, and the earth will give birth to those long dead. So here, to David's earlier point, or maybe it was Chaz's earlier point, somebody's earlier point, that now we have a direct mention of dead. We have a direct mention of corpses. We have a direct mention of the dwellers in the dust. We talked last week about dust to dust. It says that earth gives birth to those long dead. And again, even with this language that seems so explicit about the resurrection, we are, I think, right to ask the question, is this a resurrection as we think of it? Is this an afterlife, or is this a transformation or a restoration, as we talked about earlier? Is this primarily a personal reality, or is this more of a national reality? And again, I would say this is where we begin to get the idea of the resurrection, but I'm not sure that we are at the place where we have the sort of full-fledged workings out of the resurrection that we are familiar with as Christians. And sort of by way of comparison, or a similar text is from Ezekiel 37, right? Yeah, Chaz just beat me to it, to the valley of dry bones. Ezekiel 37 is another place where the prophet speaks in symbolic language and prophesies over these dead bones and raises up the nation of Israel again. And this is a pronounced symbol of God's restoration of Israel after exile. And so we see maybe that this is also what's happening in this Isaiah text, is it's looking for this restoration of the nation of Israel, or their land, their kingdom. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and make sure that if you have any questions about this portion of Isaiah, jot them down, because we'll come back to them at the end. I want us to go to Daniel 12 at this point. But if there are questions about what I've just covered in Isaiah 24 through 27, just write them down somewhere, type them out somewhere, and we'll hopefully have time to revisit them before the end of class. But I do want to hop into the book of Daniel, because this is really the clearest indicator of resurrection in the Old Testament, in the entire Old Testament. Just by way of a reminder for you all, the book of Daniel is the latest writing, most likely, in the Old Testament. It's written, in other words, closest to the New Testament, probably in the 2nd century BCE. Maybe there's some material that's earlier, but certainly its final form in the 2nd century BCE. It's possibly a composite. This should say composite, not composition, meaning that it might be different parts that have been wound together. Some of it is written in Hebrew. Some of it is written in Aramaic. it claims to have been written during the Persian period, in the mid 6th century BCE, but it is most likely written in the Greek period, in response to Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, who some of you may remember from Hanukkah celebrations, or the book of Maccabees, which is some of this intertestamental literature. But it seems to know the reign of Antiochus IV, and we can date Antiochus's reign with some degree of certainty to like the 180s, 190s BCE. And so that's what gives scholars the reason to say this is probably dated from that period. And so in Daniel 11, we get this description of the rise of Antiochus. And the reign of Antiochus is sort of put in the context of these changing global powers. So we have 4 Persian kings, the end of the Persian period. Then we have the rise of the warrior king, or Alexander the Great, the first great Macedonian king who becomes the sort of the inaugurator of the Greek world. And then a few verses describing the conflicts that the successors to Alexander engaged in. And then in verses 21 through 45, we get this long description of this guy named Antiochus Epiphanes. And in biblical literature and in Jewish literature, Antiochus Epiphanes is a master villain. He acquires great wealth and great power. But along the way, he takes particular action against the Holy Covenant. Antiochus is presented in the book of Daniel and in the books of Maccabees as someone who is antagonistic toward the Jewish people and towards their religious customs. And so verse 31 says that he profanes the temple. Verse 36 says that he makes himself greater than all the gods. Verse 32 says that he persecutes those that were loyal to the covenant. And verse 45 says that he eventually comes to an end. And so you may be thinking, why all of this background on Antiochus Epiphanes? Why does this matter for our class, for our purposes, for our discussion of Daniel 12? Well, in many ways, Antiochus Epiphanes represents a strong challenge to normal wisdom. If normal wisdom says good kings are blessed and bad kings are cursed, the story of Antiochus is he's a wicked king and he seems to only be successful. He seems to profit. He gets richer and more powerful even as he oppresses and persecutes the Israelites. The Israelites who experience persecution experience suffering and hardship not because of disobedience, not because they're unfaithful to the covenant, but because of their very faithfulness to the covenant. And those Israelites who are willing to say, maybe the covenant doesn't matter all that much, let me live maybe in a different way, they seem to experience success in life. And it seems that those who are righteous experience no vindication. In fact, they are put to death, and oftentimes put to death in horrific ways. And so, as Chaz says in the quote box or chat box, "Boo Antiochus." That was the view of Antiochus. But also, he challenged the notion of an ordered world, because those who were faithful to God experience tremendous, pronounced persecution. And so I bring this up because the resurrection text from Daniel really must be understood in the context of religious persecution. I submit that the birth of a robust understanding of the resurrection originates in a context of marginality and of extreme persecution. And it is a theological response to the goodness and the justice of God that seems to say there is no justice in this life. Those who were put to death for their faithfulness have been deprived of justice in this life. And the only way that we can account for that and make sense of that is that they will receive justice in the life to come. So here is the text from Daniel 12, 1 through 3. At that time, that is Antiochus's death, at the time of Antiochus's death, Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. There shall be a time of anguish, such as never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So if we put ourselves in the context of Daniel 12, writing in response to the persecutions of Antiochus, or either during them or slightly after them, this is a word of hope. It is a word of hope that at some point at the end, God will work to deliver the people of Israel. But here, this deliverance is not spoken of in the language of Isaiah of expanding boundaries or refortifying walls. But the deliverance is that those or some of those who are asleep in the dust will wake. They will come to new life. Some to everlasting life, it says, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So what does this text tell us about the resurrection? The first thing is it says many, but it does not say all, which most of the scholars that I'm familiar with would take this as a clear indication that Daniel doesn't have a view of the general resurrection where all humans will be raised. It's a limited group, and that there are actually two groups at play in Daniel 12. There are those who are raised to everlasting life, which most likely are those righteous sufferers, those who lost their lives because of their fidelity to the ways of God, to the covenant of God, and those who are raised to everlasting contempt. So one scholar put it this way: it imagines the resurrection of the very good and the very bad. But the people in the middle sort of are just worm's meat, right? They're just dust. It doesn't mention those in the middle. It's the exemplars and the antagonists that are raised, and the exemplars experience eternal life in some form or fashion, and the exemplars are raised for the sake of contempt, maybe punishment, and then we see that it says at the end, the wise and the righteous teachers will shine like stars, which has been interpreted by some to say that they will join the host of angels. They will join the heavenly host, and so they will experience some other form of life, a transformed form of life eternally. So by way of conclusion, and then we will open it up for conversation. I'll say what I think about this text. I don't think that this text is interested in the general resurrection, the resurrection of all people. I don't think it's at all interested in the mechanics of resurrection in the sense of how it will happen, what it will look like. We're going to get there in 1 Corinthians 15, but it's going to take us a while. And it's also not interested in what life after resurrection looks like. We don't get, like we do in the book of Revelation, a view of the raised circling around God's throne, praising forever and ever. It is just simply not interested in that. The issue, the heart of the issue for Daniel 12 is God's justice. God's goodness, God's justice are at play. And so in many ways, it presents a new version of theodicy. Why does suffering happen? How is God at work in suffering? And the answer is that God will vindicate in the world to come, in the life to come, those who suffer unjustly for their faithfulness to the covenant. That those who have been persecuted and lost their lives, the martyrs, we might say, will experience this post mortem vindication. But that activity, the resurrecting activity, doesn't pertain yet to all of Israel or all of humanity. in any way, shape, or form. So, yeah, I'm going to stop there. And David, to your comment, you say it seems that this is all based on the belief that you, through obedience, can be good enough. And yes, I think absolutely. I think that Daniel sort of holds that up, that at least these innocent sufferers were good enough, lived exemplary enough lives that they should be raised up into eternal life. Or Chaz says, or they were wise enough. Absolutely. And I think this is one of those things where we might want to at least recognize our Christian bias about, like, by grace alone, right? That's a tenet of Pauline theology and of Reformed theology. But I'm not sure that that's the case in Daniel 12. It seems as though it's not saying that these people were perfect or sinless, but it was that they were robbed of justice in this life, and they will experience justice in the life to come, I think is more of what's at work there. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up for our questions and conversation. I'm going to real quick stop